welcome to another episode of It's a History Podcast. I am your host, Madison, and today we will be looking at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. In doing my research for the H.H. Holmes episode I posted for Halloween, I also read up a lot on the World's Fair. I have always been interested in this fair, and I figured since it's still fresh in the mind, what better time to do an episode on it than the present. I would also like to note that this is the 25th episode that I have recorded, which is very exciting, and I have also had over 500 downloads for the show. Thank you to everyone who has listened to my show and continues to listen week after week. Now, back to the World's Fair. Before we look at this specific World's Fair, let's first look at what exactly a World's Fair is, because the 1893 Chicago's World's Fair was not the first World's Fair. A World's Fair, in its most simple terms, are large international exhibitions that revolve around a wide variety of industrial, scientific, and cultural themes that are on display for a period of 3 to 6 months. There have been over 100 World's Fairs since the first World's Fair. World's Fairs offer a great opportunity for host cities in regard to economic growth and development by infusing large amounts of jobs and dollars into the city for, in most cases, years in advance. Although this would sharply fall off after the end of the exhibit, it was still a great infusion of money into the local economy. The very first World's Fair was the Crystal Palace exhibition, which was held in London in 1851. It was originally commissioned by Prince Albert in an effort to create new economic links between nations. Even from the first fair, we can still follow along with some of the same underlying goals, like promoting positive relations between nations, while also showcasing what made your nation special, especially when it came to culture, technology, and scientific treasures, as well as just general marvels associated with your nation. A small warning that over the course of today's episode, there will be descriptions of what we would today consider wildly inappropriate, especially when it comes to representing different cultures. The Villanova Library pulls a quote from Robert W. Rydell that helps to explain what was happening during this time. The diversity of industries and places represented in the expositions were a big draw for visitors, but this diversity was a product of its time. Diversity, writes Robert W. Rydell, was inseparable from the larger constellation of ideas about race, nationality, and progress that molded the fairs into ideologically coherent symbolic universes, confirming and extending the authority of the country's corporate, political, and scientific leadership. To put that into some simpler terms, what he's saying is that diversity at the time was largely based on cultural stereotypes, and most of these stereotypes reinforced an already perceived notion of a particular culture. The late 19th century understanding of race and cultural appropriation was considerably different than what we understand today. I'm not trying to explain this away, just kind of warn you for some of the descriptions that will occur later in this episode. Looking at the fair directly before the 1893 Chicago World's Fair was the 1889 Exposition Universelle, held in Paris, France. This fair was where the Eiffel Tower made its initial debut, instead of a 300-meter-tall guillotine that the Parisians wanted to erect as a dedication to the 100-year anniversary to the French Revolution. The Eiffel Tower was the star of the show. Standing at over 1,000 feet high, the structure was the tallest structure in the entire world. With this creation, Alexander Gustave Eiffel, the designer of the tower, had shown that France had the edge over the U.S. in the world of iron and steel, something the U.S. was not very happy about. The fair also shocked the public as it was so big and glamorous that visitors who attended the fair did not think that any exposition after that could surpass it. France had made sure that French glory had overwhelmed everyone in attendance. And to make matters worse for the US, they had given a lackluster effort in its attempt to showcase any of its artistic, industrial, or scientific talent. The American exhibit, when compared to its peers, was not uniform and it lacked excitement. The US, next in line to host the World's Fair, was more than ready. They wanted to showcase both the US and also maybe possibly one-up the French in its grandiose large structure category. When the World's Fair was announced in the US, the thought was to originally honor the 400-year anniversary of Columbus sailing to the Americas. Much like the French, this idea of honoring a past event did not end up going over well with the majority. When trying to figure out where this event would even be held, Washington, D.C. was the first thought, but a battle soon broke out between Washington, D.C., St. Louis, New York City, and Chicago over who would be the lucky city to host this massive event. Washington as the nation's capital, New York as the capital of culture and social refinement, and Chicago, the city that rebuilt itself after the Great Chicago Fire in 1871, which was now one of the hubs of commerce, manufacturing, and architecture. The city of St. Louis was not really thought to be of World's Fair importance to those outside of St. Louis at this time, but don't fret, St. Louis would have its time to shine in 1904 when they did in fact end up hosting a World's Fair. It would ultimately be up to Congress to decide where this fair would be taking place. And on February 24th in the year 1890, the initial ballot drop had Chicago in the lead with 115 votes, followed by New York at 38, then followed by St. Louis, and then Washington. As more votes came in, New York began to gain Chicago. But by the end of the vote, Chicago had come out the victor. Now the challenge would be to not only design, but build and execute a successful World's Fair that was not only equal to Paris, but would surpass the Exposition in just 3 years' time. The man who would be in charge of designing the fair would be Daniel Burnham. He and his partner John Root ran a successful architecture firm out of Chicago. Burnham was more of the front man, a talented architect in his own right, but his charisma was what helped bring clients in, and Root's artistic designs are kind of what sealed the deal. The pair were also able to build buildings taller than others, even with the special situation Chicago had with its soil. Buildings, for the longest time, could not be built too high, as there would be issues with the foundation. Between the topsoil and the layer of bedrock about 125 feet down, there was a non-sturdy mixture of clay, sand, and water that would cause havoc on foundations. Root had suggested digging down to what they called hard pan, or the first reasonably solid layer, about 60 feet deep, pumping out 2 feet of concrete and arranging steel across the concrete at right angles, with further layers on top. The whole thing would then be covered in cement to create what Root called a floating foundation. This allowed them to build buildings taller than what had been achievable in years past. This would be important for what the men had thought up for the World's Fair. In preparation for the fair, the World's Columbian Exchange Company was established to fund and build the fair. It was quietly decided that Burnham and Root would lead the fair, as there were many architects in Chicago at the time vying for this esteemed position. There was a lot on the line. Not only were Burnham and Root's career in the spotlight, but so was the city of Chicago and the U.S. as a whole. For what they needed to accomplish, 3 years was not a very long time. There were setbacks throughout the entire process of building the World's Fair. By July of 1890, the company was still trying to decide where to even hold this massive event. And at this point, the opening date of the fair had been decided on as May 1st, 1893. Time was quickly passing, and the fair was still in the planning phase. It was also around this time that the company brought on Frederick Olmsted to design the fair's landscape. Olmsted's claim to fame at the time was being the designer of Central Park in New York. It wouldn't be until August that Olmsted and one of his firm members, Henry Codman, would travel down to Chicago to join the company. With the expanded crew, they soon decided that Jackson Park in Englewood, on Chicago's south side, would be home to the World's Fair. But it would still be months before the crew could actually start working on the fair. And to make matters worse, in October 1890, the global stock market took a downward dip, leading to fears of a recession or even a panic. And it would not have been until October 30th, 1890, again, months after Burnham had been selected to lead the fair, that he would officially possess formal authority to begin building the fair. Like, we are running out of time here. The logistics of this endeavor were, simply put, insane. Burnham would have to not only design and coordinate the buildings of this fair, but also build railroad access into the fairgrounds to transport materials, and also have to source out all of the materials that they needed. Other architects that were involved included George B. Post, Charles McKim, Richard M. Hunt, Henry Van Brandt, and Robert Peabody. None of these men were from Chicago. They were actually primarily from New York, which did manage to stir the pot amongst Burnham's fellow Chicago-based architects. With this, Burnham and Root did decide to bring on an additional 5 Chicago-based architecture firms. In any event, the cast of characters had been put in place, and the details began to be worked out. Primarily, what the fair would even look like, what would be the defining theme of the fair, what would people take away after a visit to the fair. On January 5th, 1891, the committee officially authorized Burnham to formally offer commission to the now 10 architects involved. The group would meet up again on January 10th to further discuss the details of the plans and formally visit the site of Jackson Park to really get a feel for the land. The park was 1 square mile, or 630 acres, and could be described by at least one individual as remote and repulsive. Off to a great start here. The land at Jackson Park also suffered from the sand-water combination that made building here so hard. The land was composed of a top layer of black soil about 1 foot thick, then 2 feet of straight sand, followed by 11 feet of the sand and water quicksand mixture. The group met up later and would decide on how the fair would look. They decided on a neoclassical style, and all the buildings would have a decorative cornice at 60 feet high. Their arches, domes, and walls could be higher than that, but all of the buildings would have this one particular aspect that would tie them together. It was also during this time that Burnham's partner Root unfortunately passed away after battling with pneumonia. Burnham did not have much time to mourn the death of both his friend and business partner, as work still needed to be done to carry out the fair. The group met once again, showing off their ideas and plans for different buildings the fair would showcase. There was the administration building that would be octagon-shaped with a dome that rose over 275 feet high, higher than the dome on the U.S. Capitol. This would be the building that visitors would be greeted with upon entering the fair. Then there was the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building, which, when complete, would be composed of enough steel to make 2 Brooklyn bridges, which was one of the largest structures constructed at the time of the fair. The building would consist of elevators and electric lamps. This building would be nothing but trouble from the start. The scale of these buildings was immense. What this group managed to do in the time they had was nothing short of impressive. Later on, a female architect was chosen to design the women's building of the fair. This architect was Sophia Hade, and she was only 21 at the time. Olmsted, the landscaping architect, was concerned that the architects were getting a little too carried away with the grandness of their buildings and wanted to incorporate more character into the fair. He became particularly obsessed with having boats in the lagoon for people to ride on. He also wanted the lagoon to be the landscape centerpiece. He made it so the lagoon would be dredged along the sides, with an island being created in the center. He also wanted the landscaping to be something that caught the eye of the average fair visitor. It would not be until February 11, 1891, that any actual work would be done on the park. And this itself caused quite the uproar. The MacArthur brothers, the company hired to dig a drainage ditch, had initially used the labor of 50 Italian immigrants, which then led to 500 Union men storming the fields and running off the 50 Italians. And this was soon followed by 2,000 men who were armed with sharpened sticks to get involved in an altercation with the Italians, resulting in 2 being seized and beaten. The police were involved and the crowd began to back off. This then resulted in 2 weeks of negotiations with the unions to come to an agreement on an 8-hour workday for the union members. What a way to start a project. The architects soon came to realize that what they had planned would simply take too long to build with stone, steel, and bricks. Some compromises would have to be made when it came to the building materials, because at the end of the day, this fair was ultimately a temporary installment. They decided that the buildings would be finished off with a mixture called staff, which was a mixture of plaster and jute that would be made to look like stone. There was also discussion about what kind of electricity to use, as this was the 1890s, and electricity was new. We were still battling it out between Edison's DC electric current and Tesla's AC electric current. It was decided to use Tesla's model, which was owned by Westinghouse at the time, and this decision actually helped spearhead AC as the leading way to deliver electricity. Onwards to starting construction, the land was tested to see how stable it would be, and for the most part, the land would be able to support what Burnham had planned. That is, except the spot where they planned to put the largest building. One half of the land was stable, and the other was essentially just one giant pit of quicksand. I mean, this story is literally just one thing after another. By June 1891, Burnham was still waiting on finalized drawings from the architects. The drawings were needed to actually start the construction of the buildings. After finally receiving the drawings, Burnham was able to get a construction crew in there and begin construction on July 3rd, 1891. The women's building advanced quickly, but there was some drama concerning Sophia Hayden and the head of the board of lady managers, Miss Bertha Palmer. Palmer, behind Hayden's back, had invited women from all around the world to donate architectural ornaments to make a sort of patchwork quilt of decor. Hayden was not pleased and eventually had to go to Burnham to put a stop to Palmer. In the background of the fair, banks were failing across America, which would only heighten tensions surrounding the fair and how much money was being spent to build this monstrous exposition. Beyond the fairgrounds, workers were being laid off and wages were being slashed. On the fairgrounds, fears of union strike were omnipresent, always a threat. With continued delays throughout the entire process, Olmsted, who at the time was over 70 years of age and dealing with chronic tooth pain as well as debilitating migraines, was becoming even further behind in his own work. If the buildings were not constructed on time, his landscaping could not begin on time either. There was also tension surrounding the island that was created by dredging the lagoon. Olmsted did not want any structures on the island, but he was soon outvoted by the powers that be, and the island would become home to an outdoor exhibit supplied by Japan. He did still advocate that even with the exhibit, the island should still focus on nature and landscape. The next large hurdle was what to do with the outside of the buildings. They were covered in staff and could not stay that way. It was eventually agreed upon that the buildings be painted a stark white, with lead and oil-based paint applied not by brush, but by a hose, the first spray paint. This is also why the Chicago World's Fair is called the White City, because all the buildings were finished in this stark white paint. Now, remember the manufacturers and liberal arts building that I said was nothing but trouble and also happened to be the largest and most important building? Yeah, it collapsed just 4 months before Dedication Day that was due to be held in October 1892. On June 13th, the building seemed to be singled out by a strong storm. A large portion of the north end of the building collapsed. One of the walls had not been properly braced, which caused the collapse to happen. To say Burnham was not happy would have been an understatement. The building would now have to be worked on 24/7 just to meet the deadline. They did manage to pull this off somehow, but the building and the resulting landscape did have a rather unfinished feel about it. Dedication Day soon came, and 140,000 Chicagoans listened on as a 500-member choir sang Hallelujah. The day was ultimately a success. As the year turned from 1892 to 1893, the year the fair would open, more trouble was brewing for Burnham and the fair. The winter of 92 to 93 was one of the coldest, harshest winters, and with winter comes snow, lots of snow. And of course, our favorite building, the Manufacturer and Liberal Arts building, would not get out of this winter unscathed. With the snow piling up on the roof would actually cave in. The fair was to run from May through October, and the designers had not accounted for the winter season that would happen just prior to the fair opening. A design oversight that would put the fair behind schedule once again. Some of the exhibits included at the fair, as mentioned earlier, were not of great taste, to put lightly. In February of 1891, the committee had sent the young army officer, Lieutenant Mason Schufelt, to Zanzibar to locate a tribe of pygmies. He had directions to bring back a family of 12 to 14 for display at the fair. Let's just say he was unsuccessful. Word would come just before the fair started that Lieutenant Schufelt was dead of unknown causes. Another young man, Sol Bloom, was in charge of putting together the Midway. What some wanted to be a place to educate on outside cultures, Bloom wanted to have a fun, quote-unquote, exotic experience for the average American to experience. He wanted the Midway to be full of what he claimed would be authentic villagers, and this was how he advertised the Midway to the public. The spring of 1893 brought most of the exhibits to the fair. Train and ship models came from Great Britain, and the largest artillery weapon that weighed 250,000 pounds and could fire a 1-ton shell also arrived. Ships brought over human cargo as well. These human exhibits included alleged cannibals from Des Moines and Syrian horsemen. 175 residents of Cairo, Egypt would also make the trek from Egypt over to the fair. This also included camels, monkeys, and deadly snakes. These human exhibits would be what made up the midway of the fair. Buffalo Bill, of Wild West fame, also had a home at the Chicago World's Fair. He brought with him a small army of 100 former U.S. cavalry soldiers, 97 Cheyenne, Kiowa, Pawnee, and Sioux Native Americans, and he also had 180 horses, 18 buffalo, 10 elk, and 10 mules with a menagerie of other animals. Annie Oakley was also in attendance. The food scene was quite extensive, with cuisines offering visitors tastes from all over the world. There was also a chocolate sculpture of the Venus de Milo and a 22,000-pound cheese. There were exhibits for new foods such as Aunt Jemima pancake mix, juicy fruit gum, Cracker Jack popcorn, Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, and shredded wheat. And the fair designers did end up getting their rival to the Eiffel Tower. The Chicago World's Fair was the first place to ever have a Ferris wheel. Tune in next week to learn more about that. The whole city itself consisted of 65 buildings that had the ultimate goal of showcasing new technology and innovation, Nikola Tesla's fluorescent light bulbs being one of the major highlights of the fair. When the fair's opening day came along, the fair itself was not quite complete, but the most important buildings were complete. The Midway was presentable, and Buffalo Bill was nearby to give further entertainment. He had opened his show on a nearby plot of 15 acres on April 3rd, and was easily able to fill seats for his show. The landscape did leave something to be desired, as the construction had been so delayed, the landscaping sat on the back burner for far longer than Olmsted would have liked. There was also a carpenter strike just before the opening that also further delayed the final touches to the fair. And there were still boxcars and railroads that were meant to be temporary still on site, and much of the park was still in a state of disarray. Burnham reached a last-minute deal with the striking workers to pay time and a half for overtime and important holidays. The union men signed the contract to stay on until the end of the fair. Like I said earlier, if it's not one thing, it's another. The days leading up to the park opening were accompanied by heavy rains, further delaying the landscaping efforts of Olmsted. He was directing men to plant in the rain. The night before the fair opened still had the heaviness of an unfinished project. Opening day, May 1st, 1893, was upon the architects, and 200,000 Chicagoans, alongside people such as President Cleveland, arrived to celebrate the opening of the World's Fair. 10,000 men worked through the night to make the park presentable for opening day. They cleared debris and fixed up the grounds. They touched up paint that had become streaky with the rain. Thousands of additional scrubwomen worked on their hands and knees scrubbing the floors of these massive buildings to clear them of filth and debris. President Cleveland gave a speech, and with that, the fair was open. The first days of the fair had low turnout, which scared Burnham and those who had roped so much money into what they assumed would be the success of the fair. The bank crisis was something that was still happening, and to the people, the fair was just not finished. There was a lot to be done still, and many did not want to spend the money on a ticket if they were not going to get the full experience. In these first weeks of the fair, Buffalo Bill's show would actually have more people in attendance than those to the fair. The two were not part of the same experience, but rather two separate entities. Ticket sales would increase month over month, but they were still nowhere near the 200,000 a day that Burnham initially expected. May averaged just under 40,000 attendees a day, and June averaged just under 90,000. An increase, but not anywhere near the target numbers. The fair was losing money, a lot of money. After being audited, it was discovered that Burnham had overspent by $22 million. Threats of layoffs were looming if the fair did not start bringing in more money. The 4th of July brought in 283,000 visitors to the fair, more than any single day in May and June. While helpful to the fair's money situation, the fair would need to bring in a minimum of 100,000 people a day to pay the money it owed. To do this, they lowered the train fare to Chicago in efforts to increase the amount of people willing to make the trek. On the self-proclaimed Chicago Day on Monday, October 9th, towards the end of the fair, 751,000 people attended the fair, much higher than the Paris Fair's 397,000 highest ticket selling day. They had also successfully managed to pay off all the debts that the fair had accrued. Closing day came on October 30th. It is amazing that something this grandiose and built on such a large scale would only last for about 6 months. With the closing of the fair, more than 10,000 men would leave without jobs. The mayor, who was sympathetic to the men, tried to come up with jobs for them to do, such as cleaning the streets, but it was nowhere near enough jobs to employ all of these men. The fair's closing was ultimately pushed back a day due to the unfortunate assassination of Mayor Harrison. He was a popular mayor, and the actions of one man led to the loss of his life. His funeral on October 29th, held the day after his death, meant a somber end to the fair. All of the closing activities that had been planned, such as a Jubilee March, a reenactment of Columbus's landing in America, and an award ceremony were taken off the table to commemorate the mayor. The buildings erected during the fair would only stand for another year. Just 1 year after the close of the fair, many of the buildings were destroyed in a fire. Only one building remained, and this has since been turned into the Science and Industry Museum that you can still visit if you are in Chicago. Even with all the problems that plagued the fair, it was still a matter of great pride to Chicago. What was accomplished was truly a feat of engineering and sheer will. It is a shame that we don't have more of these buildings still standing today. It is hard to describe how large scale this project was, so I will definitely be posting pictures on Instagram, because you really have to see the fair itself to appreciate what they were able to accomplish in a really short period of time. I hope you learned something new about how the 1893 Chicago's World's Fair came to be in today's episode. Sources for today's episode include Britannica, Devil in the White City by Eric Larson, Villanova University, and the New York Preservation Archive Project. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you liked what you heard, share with a friend or leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, feel free to email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram and Threads at It's a History Podcast. I am pretty active on both. Thank you again, and I hope to have you in the next one.